Brilliant. So, hi, Steve.
Hello, hi.
It's so nice to see you. And I'm glad you've had a chance to take a look at the questions that I had in mind,
Yep,
and confirm that it was okay to sort of talk along those lines.
yep, sure.
So my colleagues and I, we were watching that thing you did for TV yesterday, Swarm Catchers.
Oh, yes.
And oh my God, it was amazing. It was like really something spectacular. And I understand that the next thing is going to happen, the next event like that is going to happen 50 years from now. Is that right?
In this particular part of the world, the
Mhm.
bamboo flowering event is on a 50-year cycle. So this is related to the species of bamboo
Okay.
that grows in this part of Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar. But there are other
Uh-huh.
species in other parts of the world. So, for example, Laos has another species that is much more frequent, which is about an 11 or 12-year cycle. And then
Mhm.
there's another bamboo species in China, which is on an 120-year cycle. So
Okay.
these cycles are just sort of genetically linked to the species of bamboo. But of course, rodent outbreaks like this happen for many other reasons too. It's not just because of bamboo mass flowering. So in parts of Africa, it's related to rainfall. So if there's a prolonged period of rain, that leads to sort of increased vegetation cover, which the rats then eat. The same thing happens in Australia, for example. There they have big mouse outbreaks, plagues of mice. And again, it's related to rainfall and extra food over a longer period of time. So whenever you have a situation where food is available to rodents over a much longer period than normal, you can have these sort of population outbreaks, which are very devastating economically. People, can lose all their crops, and it's got a long, even though it happens over a fairly short period of time, it has quite long-term implications. People get into debt, they don't have enough food. So, and these areas of Bangladesh, people are actually selling their children because they can't afford to maintain them. So it can be quite tragic for some communities.
Okay. Just this thing that we are talking about, that Frank spoke to you about, and which we are talking about right now, it can be referred to using various terms like rodents, rats, uh, vertebrate vertebrate pests. So what is it exactly that we are talking about? As in, which of these terms is the most appropriate one to use, and what do they all mean?
Okay. Well, people in normal conversation will talk about rats and mice often. So we'll separate them out. And usually rats we think are as bigger animals and mice are slightly smaller. In scientific terms, they're all rodents. So rodents is a large group of animals, which isn't just rats and mice. It includes squirrels, it includes porcupines, lots of animals that have these big front teeth. When you see animals gnawing and they have these big front teeth, that they are a rodent. So rodent is a much more general scientific term that covers lots of different animals that have a certain physiology to do with the structure of the teeth in the mouth. So, but when we're talking about pest problems, we're generally talking about rats and mice. So we're not necessarily so concerned with squirrels and other kinds of rodents. So it's somewhat context specific, related to what are the issues, because in some areas squirrels are a big problem, particularly in the United States. They have some pest problems with squirrels. And the sort of work that I do, it's very much focused on what we call commensal rodents. Now, commensal rodents are the things that most people have familiarity with. These are the ones that are getting in our houses, in our cities, and in our crops. These are rodent species that are used to living alongside people. So this is things like Norway rats, the house mouse, the black rat, and these are the big pest problems within all rodents.
Mhm. So are they really humanity's oldest and most pernicious problem? And are they really deadlier than dengue and HIV in some countries?
Well, the context of that, looking at how severe rodent problems are, is really related to some of the big impacts they've had on human society in the past, particularly bubonic plague. We've all heard of the Black Death in the Middle Ages, and it really was devastating for Europe, and more than half of the population of Europe died over a period of decades. Of course, it wasn't a single incident, it was actually a whole series of outbreaks in different parts of Europe. But overall, the Black Death was massively important to not just killing people, but the whole structure of society. Because there were fewer people around in Europe, this really broke down feudalism, and essentially the lower classes, the workers, had more power in the end, because suddenly labor was at a massive shortage, and the people who owned the land had to start paying the staff a better wage, a better living. So in that sense, it was quite devastating. But the Black Death was only one of many outbreaks that have happened. So there was actually a bubonic plague outbreak in the Justinian age. So this is around the year 400 AD, which was when, again, there was a large-scale outbreak through Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. And then and essentially plague is still around even today. We're what we call in the third pandemic, which is a plague outbreak which has spread around the world through international shipping. So many parts of the world now have endemic plagues, such as parts of the United States and the Southwest, particularly parts of South America, China, Africa. It's really spread around the world and persists in these areas. And it's much more localized. So I don't think we're going to have the big sort of pandemics that we've had in the past, simply because plague can be controlled well with antibiotics. But plague is just one disease out of more than 60 different diseases. So, for example, also in the past, particularly in the New World, and in the Aztec era, when the Mayans and the Incas had quite developed civilizations in Central and South America, there were outbreaks of a disease called hantavirus, which is still around today. It still causes disease problems in the Americas and elsewhere. We're recognizing more hantaviruses all the time, the more we investigate and take samples from animals. And particularly during the Spanish invasion of the Aztecs, there were some massive population declines, and this was caused by these rodent diseases. So I put that in the context that is probably one of our most serious and long problems, because of these historical outbreaks, which have really sort of changed our history and the way that we've gone about our civilization. And they're still with us. A lot of these diseases are still a big problem, particularly in developing countries. So even quite recently, I think it was about the year 1994, there was a plague outbreak in India. And this outbreak was really devastating for the whole continent. India itself was quarantined. So all international trade was stopped, all international flights were stopped. There was a massive economic problem for the whole country. And this was because of a small outbreak in the city of Surat. And that outbreak was something that then led to this whole sort of quarantining of the country, and a big sort of economic impact.
Mm-hmm. So, apart from spread of diseases among human population, what are some of the other kind of damage or harmful effects pests bring about?
Well, mainly people observe the agricultural impact. So they're of course getting into our crops, and unfortunately, they can attack just about any crop we try to grow. So of course they like maize and rice and wheat and all these sort of staple crops, but farmers will also have problems with vegetable production. Whatever crop you try to grow, there'll be rats getting in there. And I think that's one of the things that separates them out again as a serious problem, because if you think of insect damage, most farmers, and they know, they go off and they buy some insecticides and pesticide and they kill the insects, and they have a fairly good result from doing that. The problems with rodents is that they know there's a problem, and the control that they try to put in place, they don't feel is very effective, and often the problem that rodents cause is much more sort of spread out. So you'll get damage throughout the growing season. You'll get damage even in after harvest. So farmers harvest their rice, they put it into their store, and rats are getting in there as well. So it's a much more sort of pernicious problem throughout growing food and storing food, and you know, rats get into factories, so the whole processing of flour, rats to get into our buildings and contaminating food with their feces and urine, as well as eating it. So that if you add up all these sort of impacts, you end up with quite a much larger impact economically and socially on the agriculture and our health.
At the global level, how big really is the problem? Like, are there any numbers or stats that we could look at that would sort of outline?
Sorry, you're just a bit frozen there, so I'm just wondering if you're. Can you hear me? You're frozen on my side. I'm not sure if the same is happening to you.
Hello, Steve.
Oh, you back?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I think I got your question, Abraham. So a lot of people always talk about rats never being more than a few feet away from you, and that's probably the case if you're in a big city like London or New York. They do, you know, there are rats everywhere. We see them in the metro underground systems, and certainly I think rats have been in the news in New York quite recently. So it's a problem all over the world. I think, you know, it's a problem in Europe and the United States, but I think the real problems are in developing countries. I think rats are somewhat related to poverty and living conditions. So if you're living in poor quality housing, rats, of course, can get in those houses much more easily. So it is very much a burden on developing countries and on the poor people living in those countries. So wherever there's poverty, you're going to have much more severe impacts on food and on human health and also livestock health. So unfortunately, because it's such a global problem, there really isn't those statistics there. We would really like to have better information on how severe is the problem. But the problem, as I was just talking about, is there's so many problems. You know, how do you measure the impact of 60 different diseases and then all the different crops and then all the other damage? So, you know, they're chewing through electrical wires in buildings, causing house fires. They're digging through roads and undermining structures of buildings through their burrowing into the ground. And you know, adding up all of that cost it's an enormous task. And you know, it's, you know, how do we actually assess that? I don't think any of us really have a good idea how to actually quantify the economic impact and quantify the seriousness of the problem.
You have already partly answered this, but if I could ask you again in a separate question, what are some of the exacerbating factors?
Well, hygiene and sanitation are big issues, particularly in developing countries. If you're leaving a lot of food out, and so, you know, this is a problem even in big cities. If people are just dropping their litter on the street and not putting it in the bin where it's meant to go, then that's just going to fuel the problem. And so there are, in sort of developed country situations, a lot of it is down to perhaps feeding the birds. So, you know, going to a park and feeding the ducks in the pond, but not all the ducks are going to eat that, and so you inadvertently end up feeding the pests as well. I think in developing countries there's often not enough infrastructure there, so a lot of waste is just put out in the open. So, and rats can have access to that. So if that's, I think the main things is it's about quality of sanitation, the frequency of rubbish collection, having good rubbish services, but also if you think more on the agricultural side, I think there's a real failure of understanding how to implement rodent control. So farmers, they are simply, they apply a bit of poison and they don't actually get a good result. And that's because they don't understand enough about how to actually use these poisons effectively. And they're not aware of other technologies. So a lot of it is lack of awareness and knowledge. And it's also partly, I think, we're not developing new technologies as much as we should. We've overly relied on using poisons. And I think is quite important.
Steve, I'm going to turn my camera off just to make sure that we stay connected throughout, because at this point the call is dropping like every
yes, we've frozen a bit, so that's no problem.
Yeah. So I'll turn my camera off. There. Okay. Can you still
Oh,
hear me?
I can still hear you. That's no problem.
Okay. Okay. Brilliant. Um, uh, so, uh, so in a sort of agricultural food production sort of context, what are some of the promising solutions? And why can't we just trap, fumigate, or the whole lot,
Okay. Well,
as
I mean, I
we
think
do
there
when
are.
we have an infest?
Yeah, okay. So if we're dealing with new sort of solutions, there is research going on, for example, on fertility control. So most of our control strategies at the moment are about killing rodents. So we either kill them with poisons or we kill them with traps. But actually, from an ecological point of view, it makes much more sense to stop them reproducing in the first place. Control for rodents. And if we can actually get that sort of well developed and delivered, it should be more economically feasible and economically sustainable. So that's probably the most promising solution that's not out there at the moment. So coming to the second part of your question about why can't we just kill them all? I mean, a lot of this is a challenge for any sort of pest problem. I mean, it's very expensive to do, and you always have the problems of reinvasion. So the only places where we've successfully eradicated uh, rodents or rats and mice in general are on certain islands. So if you have a small island that accidentally got invaded by rodents, so through shipping or people visiting that island, they brought rodents there by accident, we have now shown that it's possible to totally eradicate those islands, but it's extremely expensive. It requires enormous manpower and resources. A lot of it is by poisoning, so it can be environmentally damaging in the short term anyway. But it can work for at least an island that is relatively isolated. There's simply no way that we could do that on a continental basis. There's just too many rodents out there to control in that level.
You mentioned fertility control. What does that entail?
Fertility control essentially is like birth control. It would be similar to providing a poison bait, but you provide a bait that has fertility control agents in it. So essentially hormones, like the hormones that we ourselves use to control our own birth rate. We can develop similar things for rodents. There are also other ways that have been investigated about releasing, say, rodent diseases into the environment, which are naturally there already, but then doing it in a more systematic way. There's probably not very good evidence that that's actually working well. So disease aspects have been tried, it
Right.
hasn't really worked. Whereas fertility control has been tried for a lot of larger animals. So if you're trying to control deer populations or wild boar populations or other sort of larger vertebrates, fertility control has been shown to work quite well. The real challenge with rodents is because they're much smaller and more abundant. How can you make it effective at the same level? So that's still ongoing research to see how well fertility control could work.
Mhm. While preparing for the interview, I came across a term which goes like ecological based rodent management. Are you familiar with that term? And could you explain what that means?
Yes, ecologically based rodent management is very similar to another concept we talk about, which is integrated pest management. So, or what we is shortened to IPM. But unfortunately, IPM is sort of often thought of in terms of insect pest management as opposed to any kind of pest management. So the term ecologically based rodent management was really sort of coined in order to try to focus managers, pest managers, on the idea that in order to control rodents, you really need to understand the ecology, understand their behavior, and therefore being able to design better pest management strategies based on the different species that are out there and their breeding rates and as much knowledge as you can about the pests you're trying to control.
Mhm. Um, uh, in preparation for this interview, I got a sense that rodent management is not a topic that is very deeply researched or widely discussed. Is that impression accurate? And if yes, why?
Yes, I mean, rodents have really been neglected around the world in terms of control and management, I think, for a long time. I think one of the reasons for that is you get into the sociology and our own sort of fear or apathy towards rodents. So a lot of people, I think, try to control rodents and they fail and they sort of give up. And I think this sort of attitude becomes quite throughout the whole sort of from the farmer level right up to the policymaker. People just feel, well, there's nothing we can do. So I think there's a lot of sort of apathy and people give up. And what that has resulted in is that it's not, even though it's a big problem, people don't really understand the scale of the problem, and therefore they're not doing much about it. So that has a knock-on effect onto research, and that there's not a lot of research going on about rodent management. There are, of course, some good research teams around the world, but if you put that in the context of the scale of the problem, it's very much neglected in terms of understanding what the problems are and understanding the impact of the problems, and then coming up with new solutions. So it's across the world, everywhere. It's really a problem that's ignored and neglected.
Mhm. So what is the way ahead now? Should we look at the technology sector, or should we try to tackle this problem at the level of governance? Should we, do you think, beefing up health services or tuning health services towards this issue is a solution? Which of
Well,
these different areas should we look
okay.
at?
Well, I think there's lots of different things that we need to be doing. One is just raising awareness about all the problems that are out there. I mean, people, I think, again, if at the government level, there's a reluctance to admit they have problems sometimes. And this is certainly a problem I've had in the past, where no one wants to admit their country is infested with disease carrying rats. So it can be difficult to raise awareness, and also to raise awareness that there are real solutions out there. And it's not all just about chucking poison out there. There are things that people can do. So it's raising awareness about the problems, raising awareness about the solutions amongst the general public, as well as those who are in positions of decision making, and that they can actually feel there's a way to positively engage with the problems that are out there and people are suffering from. So I think that's one of the first challenges, and that also applies in the medical field. A lot of times diseases are not recognized as rodent diseases, and that is, there's increasing evidence to show that a lot of people reporting to hospital with fevers of unknown origin, those diseases happen to be caused by rodents. So it's diseases such as leptospirosis and typhus and plague, even in some areas, where people are going to hospital and the doctors simply aren't doing the tests or understanding that this is a rodent-borne disease and how to treat it. So it's clinical recognition, it's recognition amongst policymakers, it's recognition right across the general public. So I think if we have that better sort of understanding, then it becomes much more easy to prioritize resources. So at the moment, we're competing against other problems that countries have. So, they've got problems with malaria and other problems that, someone has to decide how they're going to spend the money. And I think if they understand the real impact that rodents are having, they might be more inclined to put more money towards those sorts of problems. So I think there are people out there very interested in developing new technologies, new solutions, as well as just making sure that our current solutions are more effective. But it does, I think, rest on this whole ability to raise awareness on impact, and then getting the people to support more research and development on rodents.
My last question is about the connection between the problem of rodents and whether it has any repercussions on water harvesting or field level water management. So, can rodent management techniques have repercussions related to agricultural water management?
Yes, I mean, particularly in rice production, there's a growing body of evidence that some of the new strategies and technologies or methods being used to grow rice are probably exacerbating rodent problems. So, for example, sort of alternate wetting and drying. So this is a process where rice fields are flooded with water, but then they're not maintained underwater in a long period of time. The water is allowed to go down. And this is shown to increase the rice production. It makes the rice roots grow much more strongly. So there are many good reasons why you would want to do this sort of alternate wetting drying process. However, this means the rodents can then move into the whole rice field, and burrow and increase their sort of rate of production much more rapidly. So that's one sort of aspect of it. I think there's also other things that are going on, for example, in other parts of the world, say Ethiopia, where they're trying to do a lot of soil conservation and habitat conservation, stopping erosion, and all that is, again, very good that they're doing it. But one of the sort of negative impacts, again, is exacerbating rodent populations. So what's happening in Ethiopia is they're building a lot of rock walls along slopes and contours to try to prevent erosion and save water. But those rock walls and barriers that are being built are perfect homes for rodents. So, and people are noticing that this is one of the negative consequences of some of the strategies that are being put in place to conserve water. So, and there are many others actually, and I think this is one of the challenges is coming up with real integrated solutions that look at the impacts of changes in our practice, whether that's to stop weeds or stop insect pests or conserve the soil. What other impacts do they have? And it may not always be beneficial, there may be negative impacts. And people often don't think about the rodent problem, again, because it's neglected. People think, this will save the soil or make the rice production better. But then perhaps it doesn't, because the negative consequences of rats outweigh those sort of benefits. And that needs to be studied further.
On the same note, have you also come across in your work, in your travels, any field level rodent control methods?
Well, in the field, I think it depends on the intensity of crop production. So in order to control rodents, you have to be able to invest. So if you're a farmer, you need to see that the labor and time and money that you spend on controlling any pest is actually worthwhile. So the crop has to be something where it's is important to them. They can actually make money, or it's related to their food security, and that the investment they put in is going to be beneficial. And this has shown for some strategies which are actually quite simple to implement, not so easy for me to describe to you, but there's one that's called trap barrier systems. And this is particularly used well in Vietnam and many other sort of Southeast Asian countries in rice production, where essentially you're putting a fence up. It's like a square fence, and inside this fence there are rat traps, multi-capture rat traps. And then what you do is inside this fence you put an early ripening variety of rice. So it's not a very big fence, but because the rice is in there and growing faster than all the rice outside of the fence, rats smell that rice inside the fence and they want to go eat that, because there's rice there before there's rice everywhere else. And so this little trap crop sucks in the rodents from great distances, and they all get trapped in the traps. So it requires some labor and a bit of expense, but it's actually able to clear very large areas of rats from the surrounding fields. So this has been shown to work well, and one of the real challenges is that it has to work at community level. So individual farmers will benefit over a large scale, so they all need to make some sort of input to it wherever that fence is being built. And there are other things that are related to sort of trapping instead of using poisons that have been shown to work in the same sort of way. A lot of it is about targeting control at the right time and place, which is not a new concept, but it's often not well followed. So it's about doing trapping and intensive management of populations at the right time, before the population explodes and before the population gets out of control. And if you can get farmers to do that, then it is worthwhile their time and money to do so.
Mhm. Steve, I come from a part of India called Bihar, and there's a whole caste of people that lives there who, I mean, the name of their caste literally means rat eaters. And while the practice of eating rats is very derided, it is associated with, belonging to a lower strata of the society. There are those who argue that it is not that bad a food habit after all, and also it does contribute to an extent towards rodent management. Have you come across this story, and what do you think about it?
Well, rodents are actually eaten in many parts of the world, so it is certainly specific to certain communities. But if you go pretty much anywhere in Africa, you will find communities who do eat rats. And the same is true in parts of Asia too. So rat eating is something that may be sort of disgusting or abhorrent to other communities, but in some places it's considered a delicacy. So, for example, again in Vietnam, rats are served at people's weddings, and it's, particularly for the wedding couple, to eat rats is a good sign. It helps them. Rats are a sign of fertility. So if you're a young couple trying and just getting married, eating rats is a tradition. So, and in other countries, rats are actually processed and put in tins. So you can buy them in supermarkets the way you would buy tuna fish or other kinds of meat in a supermarket. So it goes through a factory processing, and it's all sort of safe to eat in a sense. So I mean, there are of course dangers in eating rats when you're not careful about hygiene standards and processing standards. Rats can, of course, carry many different diseases, but if they're well cooked and they're handled properly when they're being butchered, those risks they're no greater than many other animals that we eat, and which can also carry diseases. So I think eating rats shouldn't be frowned upon as long as people maintain certain standards in how they're processed and cooked and before they're eaten. But also, I think this concept of eating rats leading to better control, I think you'd have to eat an awful lot of rats, and most of the time the rats are harvested after, when the population is at its highest level, after all the damage has occurred. So for example, again in sort of Southeast Asia, there are teams of people who go out and harvest rats in order to market them and sell them. But that is done at the end of the rice growing season. So the rat population is at its highest. It's already caused much damage to the rats. But that, of course, is the best time economically if you want to harvest the rats. So it's probably, the eating of rats probably has almost no impact on managing the population. The population would be naturally declining because its food resources have dissipated in the environment.
Mhm. Thank you, Steve. With that, I have reached the end of my questions. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to download this interview and sort of do a bit of editing and turn it into a video.
Great.
And as soon as I have done that, I will share it with you. And if you're okay with how it has been done, we'll go ahead and share it on the Watch channel.
Okay, good. Glad to hear.
Thank,
So,
thank you so much for your time, Steve.
okay,
Again,
thanks. Bye.
thanks. Bye bye.